Good evening and welcome. My name is Paul George. I'm Director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center, and welcome you here tonight. Very happy to see you in this lovely spring evening. We're finally getting some decent weather, and I'm glad to see it's not keeping you away. We're very honored and pleased to welcome back Michael Parenti for, I think it's his fourth or fifth visit down here now. Each time has been a new book or a new crisis. We're glad to welcome him with a new book coming out this time. The Culture Struggle. Fabulous new book. A lot of themes that have been in some of his previous 18 books, but as only parts of those books, and brought together a very important aspect of looking at the struggles that we're engaged in. Whose culture is it anyway? And so the books, of course, will be for sale, and Michael will be signing after the event. He has some of his older books here as well, and I'll just mention there are two different tills here, so pay for the older books there and pay for the newer books here. One of the reasons I'm always pleased to welcome Michael back is that he's not just an academic, not just a wonderful writer with 19 books to his credit, but he is an activist. He's one of us who's in the streets all the time, doing what it takes to bring about a better world. He lives what he writes, and we really appreciate that. He's going to speak tonight on race, gender, and class. Please join me in giving Michael a warm welcome. Michael Parenti. Well, we're going to welcome one of us.
I'm not talking about the book tonight. The book has a lot of different themes in it, having to do with how to think about culture, what to do about cultural imperialism, how do you deal with cultural relativism, what do you do with race, and how culture is has a material component and a political dimension and all that stuff. I'm not going to really talk about that. I am going to talk about a sort of a related theme, and some of the things that I mentioned tonight are in the book. But the subject is race, gender, and class struggle is what I'm really going to talk about. There is that holy trinity of race, gender, and class, and it's perfectly all right to treat them as separate and distinct concepts, and distinct and separate from each other. Because in many respects they are. The mistake, though, is to consider them unconnected and to consider them mutually exclusive and even sort of in competition with each other, which unfortunately has been the development in identity politics, which I'll talk about a little more later. In regard to many issues, they are very much interrelated, and they're part of the same overall systemic dynamic. There's two ways of looking at class. The first is to treat it, and this is the most common way, and to the extent that class is even looked at in this society, to the extent that it is, it's in this way. Class is a demographic trait. It relates to income, lifestyle, status, upper middle, middle, lower middle, upper, whatever. There's another way of looking at class, and I don't know why a language which has millions and millions of words, you ever see how thick the dictionary is, why they couldn't get two separate words for this. Another way of looking at class is as a dynamic interrelationship, a relationship having to do with political economic power. So there's no such thing as one class. You can never think of a class. A class gets its definition only in relationship to another class. You can't have slaves unless you have slave holders. You can't have serfs unless you have lords. You can't have lords unless you have serfs. You can't have employers unless you have employees. You can't have plutocrats and capitalists unless you have workers. So this interrelationship is really linked to a third factor, which is the material conditions of society, the means of production. One of these groups owns the means of production. One of these groups owns the wealth or has access to the natural resources and has the industry and has the technology and has all that stuff. And the other group has nothing but its labor, which it sells. And it gets back much, much less than it produces. So that becomes the important component of class. The reason class differs from race and gender is that you can imagine, I'm not saying we have it, you can imagine equality in race, and you can imagine equality in gender, but you can't, by definition, imagine equality in class. If you have equality in class, then you don't have any classes. You have a classless society, which we have had in history. Through most of our history, we've had classless societies. Primitive societies have been, for the most part, there have been status differentials, of course, in all tribes or any kind of group even. But there wasn't some small group monopolizing the means of production and having hired retainers to force the other people to keep their hands off it and so forth and so on. So that's the big difference. It has to do with class. And the crucial component here is not class as this demographic trait, but class power. And that is what we have to be thinking about, class power in that sense. That's what ownership brings, and that's what economic power brings. It's easily translated then into cultural predominance and political power also. I remember I did support work, strike support work for auto strikers in Carbondale, Illinois. We only went down one day, but then they came up to where I happened to be in Illinois that year. And there was one of the strikers, he was African-American man, and he put it this way. He said, either you own the mother or you work for it. And that's what it is. Either you own the mother or you work for it. He used a much longer word than mother, but that was it. Either you own the mother and you work for it. Now, wealth and poverty don't just happen to coexist. We always tend to see them as in some kind of innocent but very unfortunate juxtaposition. We say, isn't it terrible, so much wealth here and so much poverty, and isn't that just terrible, how unfortunate and how unequal? Well, there's a reason. They don't just coexist, they are dynamically interrelated. Because wealth creates poverty. The labor of the poor creates wealth. The underclass creates the overclass. You can't have rich without having poor. The slave owners can't live in the luxury to which they're accustomed unless they had slaves working all day long creating value. James Madison calculated once to a friend that his slaves cost him, his average slave cost him to maintain $25 a year, and that slave produced about $250 in value. So they calculate, they have slaves for a reason, and it's to make money off them. And so it is with the plutocratic class. It can't live the way it does without others who work hard all their lives and who end up with relatively little. Often they find not even their pension fund exists anymore. And the colonizer cannot gather wealth without exploiting and impoverishing the colonies. There's a constant redistribution of wealth from those who produce it to those who own the production system and control it. And this upward redistribution takes place in other ways too. You could say, well, I'm not class exploited because I work for a nonprofit. I don't work for a boss who makes a lot of money. But they get to you too. The other ways are through, as consumers, you are cheated again and again. As taxpayers, our regressive tax system, we pay for hundreds of billions of dollars every year in corporate subsidies, export subsidies, loan subsidies, every sort of thing, equity, direct equity, grants and aids. The corporations every year are getting money from us all the time, and that process of upward distribution is through the tax system. And also, just as community members, through plunder of the public domain, which belongs to the people we're paying right there. We own, for instance, the people of America own the airwaves. The airwaves are our property, really, but you have these giant networks that are making enormous sums of wealth and profit from it. Now, discussions of racism. There, too, there's a terrible deficiency in concept and such. And I have a couple of chapters in the book about race and racism, and I'll mention some of that right here. But the problem with racism is that it usually fixes upon attitudes. Why do people feel that way? Why are people so filled with ill feeling, and it's fear, and it's this and that? And if we all just sat together with each other and talked to each other, why, we would certainly see our common humanity. Well, it's more than attitude. There's a larger system of power and interest that sustains racist attitudes. That's why we should not only speak of attitudinal racism, but institutional and systemic racism, that the very structure itself operates. In modern-day capitalist corporate societies, and by the way, the minute you bring in capitalism and all that, someone does say, well, nothing wrong with capitalism. I mean, what about the mom-and-pop entrepreneurial system that the people that go out and they get an idea and they market a commodity and they create some jobs for other people and they perform a service and they do this and do that. And I always say, I'm not talking about the mom and pop small enterprises and small businesses. We're not talking about that. We're talking about these giant transnational multi-billion-dollar corporations. The small businesses are like the squirrels dancing among the elephants. And squirrels that dance among elephants have a very low life expectancy. And it doesn't mean that small business isn't important. In this country, almost all the job growth is from small business, medium-sized business, and the public sector. The giant corporations, the net job growth from giant corporations in this country is zero. I mean, of course, they create new jobs, but with downsizing, outsourcing, and closing plants, you add it all together, the net is about zero. So, racism and sexism really perform very important functions for transnational corporate capitalism. And they perform a number of systemic functions. First of all, employers have always desired a surplus workforce. When there's full employment, when jobs are looking for workers, then wages tend to go up. When wages go up, that cuts into profits. Conversely, when workers are in superabundance in an overcrowded job market, then wages can be kept down. Now, for generations, women, children, immigrants, and people of color who have been especially targeted for discrimination, the Chinese laborers who came over, the Irish immigrants, well, they were just immigrants, they weren't of color, African Americans, most dramatically Latinos, they have been a super exploited labor pool because of the discrimination against them, because of the limits imposed upon them. They have often had to work at jobs for less wages. So they depressed the wage floor. And that was the function. I mean, one of the things that made women in the late 19th century employable was their willingness, I put quotes around willingness, their need to work for less wages and to suffer work conditions with less resistance than maybe men might have. Women, children, immigrants who couldn't speak the language, African Americans who lived under lynch law terrorism. These people became this reserve army of labor that helped to depress wages, lowered the floor on wages. Racism and sexism also served class power as a divisive force. They helped keep the working class fragmented, disorganized, fighting each other for crumbs rather than concerting for a larger slice of the pie, beating your wife instead of organizing to beat your boss. Economic elites, by the way, seem well aware of this function, for they consciously discourage working class unity and consciously have been known to incite inter-ethnic competition. This goes back to as early as Plato and Aristotle. You could read Aristotle's Politics. I think it was in Book 1. He talks about how the slaveholder should mix the nationalities of the slaves in his work gangs. Don't have them all from the same area, so that they don't concert and they don't pursue mischievous goals and such. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, oil and mining companies consciously promoted disunity and hostility among immigrant groups in company towns. Even, again, they would mix their work teams. They'd have a Pole, a Hungarian, an Italian, a Swede, have these guys all mixed up so that they, not because they had read Aristotle, but because they were facing the same class manipulative situation, and it occurred to them to do the same. In the 1600s in North America, 1600s, early 17th century, before the laws and ideologies of slavery and racism were well developed, you had white indentured servants and black slaves who not only worked together, but lived under the same hard conditions and even fraternized and even intermarried. I mean, the reason you have miscegenation laws is to prevent people from intermarrying. The reason you need laws to prevent them from intermarrying is because they are showing this tendency to intermarry. So racism is something that has to be taught from on high. It's very much like the way anti-Semitism had to be taught to the European peasantry by the lords and bishops, which Christianity did once it came into ascension in the 4th century and really into the earlier 5th century. There was a constant effort, constant edicts coming down for hundreds of years on the peasantry to stop fraternizing with the infidels. There was too much of it. The Jews were demonized and ghettoized. Jews and Christians used to actually sometimes attend common services. The Jewish minister, or whatever they called him, who knows what they called him, a rabbi or whatever, he would even come and preach to a Christian congregation. The bishops would get apoplectic about this. The Jews were finally subjected to discriminatory laws. They were made the objects of violence and pillage. They were demonized. The peasants learned slowly, but they did learn. And they learned to channelize their legitimate grievances and anger away from their lords and toward irrelevant and innocent enemies. And from the Lord's point of view, that's perfectly fine. Rather than having the angry peasants come and burn your manor or burn your cathedral, they went and burned the synagogue. And And so in America, slaveholders and land grabbers endured a lively fear that the indentured servants would join with the blacks and the Indians against the propertied class, as happened more than once, by the way, as happened more than once. It's one of the great unwritten parts of our history. So the colonial governments pursued a conscious policy of creating aversions, turning the Indians against the blacks and the poor whites against both of them. In U.S. prisons, right down through modern times, officials have consciously promoted friction between white and black and Latino gangs. In the early 1970s, a politically conscious prisoner, his name was Stephen Kessler, I think it was in Oregon or Washington State, he was explicitly charged with all sorts of, he was a problem prisoner, politically problem prisoner, organizing, protesting against certain conditions and all. But one of the charges against him was, literally, explicitly, I quote, fomenting racial unity. Well, that says it all. I rest my case. Racism is very useful. So that racism is not an irrational outcome of a basically rational social order. It's the rational outcome of a basically irrational and unequal and unjust social order. Generations of racial segregation in the U.S. South, in South Africa too, had the effect of setting white workers against black, competing for scraps off the table, and it's still the case. Now, inciting racial divisiveness has been a standard policy of imperialists for hundreds of years. The North American colonizers and European colonizers played on tribal rivalries. They set one group against another. They gave arms to the different groups so they could start shooting each other. They planted rumors, threats and promises and all that sort of thing. The Austro-Hungarian Empire played many nationalities against each other. The CIA incited the Hmong tribal people in Vietnam and played on tribal rivalries in Vietnam, tribal mistreatments. There may be histories of things there between these groups, and the CIA went right in and played on that. Did the same thing in Angola. Showed a sudden compassion for the Mosquito Indians in Nicaragua during the Sandinista regime. All of that was to divide and undermine these revolutionary societies. Yugoslavia is a dramatic example of how Western intelligence forces egged on the separatist and secessionist people. They supported the most retrograde secessionist elements in Croatia. Franz Tuđman, Ustashi Nazi, and even brought all these Ustashi Nazi collaborators from World War II into his regime, heading Croatia, driving out 250,000 Serbs from their ancestral homes in Croatia. In Bosnia, the CIA, the NATO, and the U.S. supported Izetbegovic. Izetbegovic had been a member of the Hitler Youth, the Muslim SS, who helped transport Jews and Gorani and Roma, who we call gypsies, and lots of Serbs to Jasenovac Foundation, to Jasenovac concentration camp. I'm on the advisory board of Jasenovac Foundation, but the concentration camp where they were killed. The KLA in Kosovo, cited by the U.S. State Department as a terrorist organization with links to Al-Qaeda, but suddenly became a liberation movement of Albanian nationalists whose first targets were other Albanians. They killed Albanians who supported the Yugoslav Federation and wanted to stay in it, maybe sometimes had federal jobs, park service, whatever else. These people were systematically terrorized and killed. These were the people who were supported, and Yugoslavia, which had been a fairly prosperous, self-defining country, it had no interest in joining NATO or the European Union. 80% of its economy was publicly owned. It was broken up using this, playing on these racial things, with lots of guns and arms and all that other stuff, money being brought in. It was broken up into what it is now, a cluster of right-wing republics, impoverished, where everything has been privatized and everything's been deregulated, and unemployment is 20, 30% up, and the like. Much of politics is the rational manipulation of irrational symbols. And that's what racism is. And by now, I guess you should be able to guess, racism has two historical sources. One is slavery. When you enslave a people and you take them and use them in this way, you justify it by saying they're treacherous, they're stupid, they're morally inferior, they're this, they're that, and the other thing. And the other is imperialism, as I've just gone through and explained. When you go in and you plunder their land and such. The imperialists, by the way, were not innate racists. I mean, racism wasn't the first item on their agenda. In fact, they didn't even care what race you were. The first acts of imperialism in the modern era, I mean, putting aside ancient Greece, ancient Rome, was Western Europe against Eastern Europe. And the Eastern Europeans were Europeans, they were Caucasians. England's oldest, or Great Britain's oldest colony was Ireland. You can't get any whiter than the Irish. I mean, they're white, they're pink-faced, and they're Caucasian. So when they went into Africa, it wasn't, let's go in and be mean to these black people. They didn't care. They didn't care who was on the land. They wanted what was in the land. They didn't care about the color line. They were interested in the bottom line. But in short order, after you go in and you massacre the people, you burn their homes, you destroy their mines, you destroy their kilns and their little production systems, and you rape their women and starve them and whatever in India and Africa and Asia, North America and such. You have to justify that. So you start talking about them as animals and beasts and not civilized, not someone you'd want to turn your back to, and horrible. That the only good Injun is a dead Injun. You remember that was an expression in America for more than a century, and so that's where racism comes in handy. And then, of course, it develops a momentum of its own. Today, we also see that conservatives consciously cultivate race and gender issues as a way of marshaling support for right-wing candidates who in other ways violate everybody's class interests. And by everybody, I mean 99% of the population. Not that fraction, maybe not that fraction of 1%. There's about 145,000 households in this country that own the lion's share of the wealth. They're a fraction of 1%. I can't stand it when you had these people talking about the top 20 richest percent and all that. What is that top 20? You make $60,000 a year, you're in the top 20. You make $100,000 a year, you're in the top 4%. That's not the capitalist class. That's not the people that George Bush works for. He told you who he works for. He says, these are the haves. They call you the haves. I say you're the have-mores. You're my base. That's who it is. Now, how do you appeal to the other 90% of people? Well, I even heard a group of right-wing pundits, you know, these who overpopulate the Sunday talk shows. It was William Buckley was one, and I forget several of the others, sitting there saying, how can they appeal to the middle Americans? They meant the unwashed masses. They didn't want to say unwashed masses. But how do we appeal to them? And they said, well, we have to appeal with, and they explicitly said we have to develop many culture issues. Abortion, intrusions of feminism and the awful excesses of feminism. They use terms like that. And then the most recent one, of course, we saw gay marriage. I mean, that was like throwing red meat at him just before the 2004 election. Take abortion. Conservatives used to be in favor of abortion. They had a feeling the poor have too many children, too many of them on welfare, they should have abortions and such. Ronald Reagan signed one of the most liberal abortion bills in America here when he was governor of California. George Bush Sr., when he was in Congress from Texas, he supported legalized abortion. It was only later when they discovered that they could use abortion to really split the traditionally Democratic Catholic vote or the Protestant fundamentalist vote and activate those people. It's only then that they suddenly thought of abortion as being a terrible thing. And even then it was a hypocritical position. When George Bush Sr. was running for president against Bill Clinton for re-election, he was interviewed in some place, and one of the questioners said, well, what if you're, I guess it wouldn't have been his daughter, I think it was his granddaughter or something, or his niece, or whoever it was, someone who's close to him though, what if she got pregnant and felt she couldn't have the baby? He said, well, that would be her decision to make. He just came out and said it. Whoops. Not all of you other American women in America, your decision to make, but that would have to be her decision. I couldn't tell her, he said. Well, there you are. He didn't say she has to have the kid because abortion is murder. It was an interesting slip. So this is what they do. They come out and they try to take the average American's legitimate grievances and direct them toward irrelevant enemies, the abortionists, the feminists, the gays, the blacks, the immigrants, the people who lack family values, and those kind of things. Remember, that's another issue, family values. All of these guys coming out for family values. You know, Newt Gingrich, who dumped his wife and to go romping around with his secretary. His wife was on her cancer bed, remember, and he came in with his divorce papers to get her to sign the papers when he visited her in the hospital. She and her kids had to get support from the church. This is Newt Gingrich, Mr. Family Values guy. Talked family values. Phil Graham talked family values. He dumped his wife and ran off with some little cutie there. Dan Burton, Republican of Indiana, married with 3 kids, one of the best leaders in the House for family values, talked about it all the time, had a girlfriend on his payroll, had several ladies on his staff whose work he couldn't explain. What exactly do these women do? Huh? What does Tammy, Fluffy, and Winnie do? I don't know. I made that part up. Well, family values. He was a real paterfamilias, wasn't he? His whole office staff was one big happy family there. And then not long after that happened, what came out after the Burton story? That story came out that a number of these family value members of Congress were patronizing male prostitutes right there on Capitol Hill. Male prostitutes. I heard that story. I was just filled with loathing and disgust and horror. I mean, that just certainly lowered my opinion of male prostitutes. Well, now aside from ethnic divisions and gender divisions, and playing gender off on the workplace, has been a very real thing. It's been done again and again. There was a very wonderful movie just recently. It came and it was here only a week and it left, called North Country, about women. Go get it on the DVD. It's with Charlize Theron. She's worth the price of the DVD right there. And she played a terrific role, and all the acting was really very good. And it really showed how these women had to fight even in the Union, and how it weakened the Union as an instrument. One of the women was a Union rep, and what happened to her. So there's been terrible ethnic divisions and gender divisions, but along with that, there's also been ethnic unity. There's also been gender unity, and much of that comes in the crucible of class struggle. I mean, labor struggles have sometimes achieved real ethnic unity. In recent years, you've had African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and white workers, male and female, have stood shoulder to shoulder in major strikes by steel workers, coal miners, dock workers, teachers, and hospital employees. Those are the list I could dig up, and I'm sure there are other cases of it too. What happens in America, and it happens on the left too, by focusing exclusively on race and gender, we forget that there's also a terrible class divide, and we then overlook how class operates in race and gender problems. The growing morbidity differentials in the United States seem to be explained not only by looking at race and gender, but by looking at class. In fact, class is a more strategic factor regardless of race or gender. As the public health expert Vicente Navarro noted, a very fine writer on health policy, Vicente, he should write more. I don't say that about many people on the left, but do of him. Quote, many of the things that are assumed to be characteristic of blacks are in fact characteristic of low income. But the U.S. government collects data only on race and gender while ignoring class. Now this negligence, I maintain, is not indicative of a lack of class awareness, but of a keen sense of class. A sense of keeping it off the agenda, a sense of keeping it out of our consciousness. We don't deal with class. Equal protection of the law, due process, those always relate to race and gender and other things, not to class. The Supreme Court has made that very clear also. Now you look at class bigotry and it resembles race and gender bigotry. The lower classes were always seen as lazy, worthless, visceral, improvident, self-indulgent, morally depraved, criminally inclined, incapable of self-improvement, creatures of impulse and violence, self-victimizing. They were the authors of their own poverty. And of course, sometimes under very severe economic oppression, there are indeed social pathologies that take over in a way. Now that image fits the bigot's portrait of various ethnic groups, doesn't it? It's also isn't that far from the stereotype of women: weak, flighty, irresponsible, untrustworthy, not competent. In Christianity, you even got women as the evil corrupters and seducers, the Jezebels and the like. Well, I think I pretty much said everything I want here. Let me just give you one example, one or two more things, and then I'll wrap it up. Robert Cole, the Harvard psychologist, he did a study. He went and interviewed any number of people. He interviewed African-American families, working families, and he found that these African-American working families had a sense of class power. He found that his respondents would ask him if he also had interviewed, quote, the rich folks. So Robert Cole, being a good mainstream intellectual, a liberal and all that, heard the rich folks, and of course, what did he understand? You can't be talking about class, you must mean race. He says, don't you mean the white folks instead of the rich? And they say, no, we mean the rich, the ones who decide how the poor folks live, they would say. One African-American lawyer, now this isn't the working class respondent, this guy was a lawyer, okay, but he's African-American. He says to Cole, if you want to know why black people live the way they do, you ought to talk not to the ordinary working class white people, because they're also victimized, but he suggested that Cole talk to the affluent and powerful people who own the farmlands and the factories. Here's a quote, they own everything and they decide what happens in this city and in all other cities, said this African-American lawyer. It gets even more interesting. Cole interviews white families, and they too begin to refer to the rich or the big shots with plenty of money and all the power they want. They didn't start with the usual thing about, oh, the blacks, they're on welfare, they're getting it all, and we're being neglected and all that. They talked about the rich. So Cole's interviewees, mostly working class African Americans and working class whites, were introducing him to the concept of class power. He was introducing him to the concept of class power. They were taking the famous Harvard professor to school about something that academics and intellectuals in this country have programmed out of their perceptions, even when it hits them right in the face, and that is class power. He was asking working class people questions, but he forgot to ask them about class and class power. In sum, we don't have a full understanding of the functional imperatives of racism and sexism unless we take into account the political economic context. And by the way, my book, The Class Struggle, also argues that there's a political economic context for understanding perception, understanding the dominant paradigm, and understanding culture. Culture is both a dynamic, the outcome of a power situation, and also an instrument of that power. So we should move from attitudinal analyses to institutional and systemic analyses. We should see how class power translates into social and cultural power. Well, the failure to perceive racial and gender oppressions within the context of class power oppression leads to what I've called in one of my books somewhere along, I called it the competition of oppressions. I mean, I have sat in at meetings, I remember one in Washington, D.C., where people have gotten up, an African-American guy got up and he said to this white woman, he said, you may be a woman, but you're white. And she gets up and she said, yeah, you may be black, but you're a man. And then a third woman got up and says, yeah, you may be black and you may be a woman, but I'm a lesbian, and I'd like to see which of us gets turned down for a job. If I told the boss that I was a lesbian, I would have more. In other words, I'm more oppressed than you are. No, I'm more oppressed than you are. And that comes out of this idea, this feeling that, after all, I feel the urgency of my oppression more than I feel the urgency of yours, but also if you can understand how more oppressed I am, then maybe you'd be doing more for this oppression. And in fact, I think in some situations, some oppressed groups are more oppressed than other groups. It depends on what particular thing you're looking at. Let me just end with a little story. I remember at the founding convention of the Committees of Correspondence, that convention took place in 1992 in Berkeley, California, where I live, just about a 15-minute walk from me up on the campus. So I went over and I attended the convention, and they were lining up. I never joined, but they were setting down their statement of goals and intentions, and a guy got up from the floor, at a microphone on the floor, and he says, you have nothing in there about the rights of gays. And they said, oh yes, let's put something in there, rights of gays. And a woman got up and she said, you have nothing in there, it should be gays and lesbians. And he said, right. And I said, gays and lesbians. A guy gets up and he says, now transgender and transsexual hadn't yet quite come into vogue. That was a couple of years down the line. But he says, it should be gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. Because we bisexuals get discrimination from both communities sometimes. They say, oh, yes, yes. They put, gays, lesbians, bisexuals. And I was sitting there, and behind me was this old lefty trade union type of a guy, and he said, just loud enough for everybody to hear, he said, yeah, and how about putting something in there for the people who are too tired to have sex when they get home from work? And that, ladies and gentlemen, that's who I speak for, the people who are too tired to have sex when they get home from work, which by the way includes any number of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, everybody else, in this very exploitative, oppressive society that we must continue to resist and rectify. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We'll bring Michael back up in just a moment for some questions, answers, dialogue. I just want to take a moment to give you a few announcements of upcoming events. There's flyers out in the lobby for all of these. Be sure to pick them up and come to these events we have coming up, sponsored by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. Now let's bring Michael back up for some Q&A. And Linda, Linda has a mic to bring around to the audience so we can get it on the video. The mic's right over here. So, and Linda, do you want to pick people out, or should we just send Linda off to whoever has their hand up?
Well, I don't know. Maybe Linda, when you pick people, make sure you alternate gender. It's got to be a man and woman, then a man and a woman. Because look, only guys get their hands up. I won't. No, I was serious about that. I really mean that. I don't want to just call on men. Go ahead.
Michael, do you think what's going on now between the ethnic struggle in Iraq between the Sunnis and the others is something that we have fomented? It goes along with what you've been talking about?
Yes, exactly. That the rivalries, which are historic and there, have been incited as the situation's gotten more desperate in Iraq. People revert to more fundamentalist positions, and the hatreds build up, and so it goes. And I think the different separatist groups have been getting money. For instance, in Iraq there was not this level of terrorism and strife and fundamentalism. It was pretty secular. It's gotten really much worse. It's very much like Central America, where they got so desolated by the horrible repressions and wars and death and counter-revolutionary wars that the U.S. perpetrated and mass killings. People are staggered. They're now all kind of moving toward these right-wing evangelical fundamentalist Protestant groups that are very politically reactionary groups, and told that all this happened to them because they weren't living right and they weren't respecting God's word, and they have to contemplate how to live better and personal pieties and not worry about their poverty or anything like that, because the next world is the more important world, and the like. So there is a real relationship between imperialism, invasions, occupations, death, wars, and the growth of fundamentalism, and then fundamentalist strifes and conflicts. Yeah, we see that all the time. It would be nice if the questions you ask would relate to, if you could in some way relate them to what I talked about tonight. I really don't want to get into every subject in the book. Yeah. Well, I'll get into every subject in that book, but not.
Yeah, I know you wrote a book called Make Believe Media years ago,
yeah.
Which basically showed how movies and television shows, which were thought of as liberal or to the left, actually supported and sustained the class system that we have now. Do you have any plans for updated? Because it was all like All in the Family was in there, and it was old.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to update the book. I made my statement about the politics. The subtitle of that book was "The Politics of Entertainment," and it shows how there's very rarely a non-political book. Movie. The movie will have some images and impressions that are conditioning you one way or another. It's no. No, I don't think I want to, because it means having to sit through and watch all that crap again. I really can't do it. So I used to cheat too. I'd talk to friends. I said, you watch that soap opera? Tell me, what's it about? What happens is, and I just get information, because I didn't want to have to sit and watch the damn thing. Oh, it's awful. Yeah. Are there no ladies who, after I've talked about now? There we go. Good. Would you stand up?
In these culture war that you were talking about, you forgot to mention Walmart. Walmart is setting the standard for, retail trade. Most of the retail trade are women. And Andrew Young, the great civil rights, person, is now a lobbyist for Walmart. And, how anybody with social conscience can shop there is beyond me. But you forgot to mention the conflict of cultures.
Oh,
and Walmart. That's the greatest threat we have today in this country as far as that particular.
There's a whole list of things I didn't forget to mention. It's just that I couldn't keep you here for 20 hours. But Walmart, I don't know how Walmart actually figures directly in the culture wars. And my talk wasn't about the culture wars as such, although I did allude to that the manipulation, the conservative manipulation of cultural issues. Walmart is the biggest employer in the country, and there's some very good things if you want to. There's a very good DVD out called Walmart, the High Cost of Low Prices. And the prices, by the way, aren't that low. They build 3 Walmarts in a row, wipe out every small business, then they close 2 of them down, and then you have to drive over to that one that's open. There is a counter. There's an opposition developing, a more conscious opposition, active opposition to Walmart, as you know. The Waltons, who own Walmart, are the richest people. Bill Gates is the richest because he doesn't split his fortune up. But the Walton fortune, Bill Gates is worth about $50 billion now or something, and the Waltons are worth, I added it all together, I think they're about, I forget now, I think it's about $78 billion. But there's 5 of them, so they each got an equal amount there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, in regards to what you're talking about, the way in which the conservatives manipulate the folks who would normally not vote for them.
I can't understand what you're saying.
I said in regards to the conservative manipulation of those who would normally not vote for them because it isn't in their interest, i.e. everybody, except the 150,000. You were talking about factors of fear that they use to manipulate the way in which we think about certain issues, but there's also, I would think...
Where are you talking about, Iraq?
No.
Oh.
The conservatives who people vote for, Mr. Bush, how does he get them? How does he get the people who are not rich to vote for him? You were speaking about that earlier, I thought.
Right.
And you spoke about elements of fear that they use, but they also use something else, which is desire. I would think, and I'm wondering what you think about this, i.e. they appeal to the American dream, which is an illusion, which no longer really exists for most people. The idea that anyone can be a millionaire, that anyone can be powerful and rich, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Would you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is also one of they do that with the estate tax, and they say someday, you may have $1 million and you want to give it to your kid, and it'll be, which by the way isn't true. The estate tax has, I think, now $2 or $3 million total exclusion Oh, yeah, I think you have to give somebody over 5 million before it starts getting taxed. So they will make those appeals, and there are people who do respond. You should point out that George Bush lost the last election in 2004. Kerry beat him very thoroughly. That election was stolen by the touch screen things. Every county in America that had a touch screen system of voting went for Bush. It correlated with nothing else. It correlated with no income level, past voting patterns, ethnic group or locale or wherever. Every anomaly in the vote count came out favoring Bush. In the state of Florida, they counted 25,000 more votes than there were registered voters. It wasn't the early exit polls that showed Kerry ahead. The exit polls all day long showed him ahead, 53 to 47%, and there were these anomalies happening in about 12 of the swing states. It wasn't just Ohio and Florida. It was happening all around, and in 2000, 50 million people voted. In 2004, there were 65 million. I never saw a jump like that before. I've never seen such an intense involvement. And what we get are people on the left fighting the last war and saying, we've got to be able to mobilize people and really get them out in numbers and this and that. Well, that's what the hell you did. You did do that. And the majority of the new voters were voting for Kerry, or at least against Bush. People are not all that happy, not even the middle Americans and all those people. Job creation is minus, it's down. Wages are flat, despite all the prosperity of things. Those bread and butter issues do get across. Now, there are people, though, who are so, their legitimate grievances have been channelized. It's what the conservatives do all the time. It's what the Lords did through medieval times. It's what Adolf Hitler did in Germany. He took the Germans' legitimate grievances and directed them toward irrelevant enemies, the Versailles Allies, the trade unionists, and the Jews. Behind this all were the Jews, blah, blah, blah. So that's what they're doing. They have successfully, but it's not been all that successful. I don't believe that George Bush has anything like a majority. Never did have. Not in 2000, not in 2004. So that may not be the crucial issue. The crucial issue may be how do we get an honest vote? How do we get places where people don't have to stand for 8 hours in the rain to get to vote? And how do we get them from suppressing the vote? We see it happening here in California. I mean, they're targeting California. Schwarzenegger, the first thing he did was he went after the Secretary of State, Shelley, got rid of Shelley and put his guy in, who is now pruning the voting rolls, reducing them by as much as 25% in heavy Democratic areas. They're going to do to California what they did to Texas and Georgia. And once they get control of the state legislature in California, they will redistrict the congressional districts. These guys play for keeps, and the Democrats don't have a goddamn clue on this, not in any organized way. They're so afraid to talk about it. Several of them, you remember when the whole need for that recount with Barbara Boxer and all, several of them conceded, said, no, we know George Bush won the election. We know he won it. I didn't know that at all. And they're just so, they cannot face the enormity of what it is we're up against. And that should be the number one issue. How do we get democratic elections in this country? Yeah, now that I've depressed you enough, maybe we should call it. All right, here's a lady, yeah.
One thing that I find very troubling is the fact that the Republicans are so clever in terms of the rhetorical war. And just to give one example, how about the word entitlements? Where are the Democrats in this respect? You gave the example earlier of George Bush talking about the have-mores, and I saw that in the Michael Moore movie. But why on earth didn't the Democrats jump on that? I mean, that would have been such a great opportunity. I don't know what's happening.
There are
in this
some
regard.
Democrats who do, and there are some people, but of course they don't own and control the media, so that's a hard problem. That the media, which is called the liberal media, and the conservatives attack the media to keep them on the defensive, so that they will always be dressing up their right, you know, so that if they get somebody like me on the radio, they'll come with confrontational questions. I won't mention somebody on KQED who does that whenever he has me on. He starts with the confrontational questions at me. His next guest, he goes, oh, and how do you, yes, oh, I see, that's very interesting. Oh, I see, right. They got to show they're tough with anybody to the left of them, while they're always fawning to the right and saying, well, we don't really disagree that much. You know, there's a common ground here and all that. The conservatives know that the war is the war of propaganda, and if you win the propaganda war, then you're halfway there. And everything they do is on message. If you look at Fox, for instance, compare O'Reilly to Larry King. I mean, what is Larry King? He hasn't a clue. He doesn't know. He's a sort of a liberal of sorts, but he doesn't know. I mean, he's not in any struggle of any kind. His big goal is to show that he's Larry King and he's interesting and he's a regular guy and he's not too liberal and all that. They don't have any such restraints. Everything they say, they turn into a polemical point. That's what I'll say about Newt Gingrich, and he did it well. Everything he ever said, got up and said, he turned it into a polemical point. He wasn't, and the liberals and the Democrats, they're thinking about, well, what's more accurate? Is it this or is that? Is this true? Or some of them do launch polemical points and all, but they sputter out because they don't have there's a systematic, concerted effort being made by the ruling class to nail down this thing called democracy and undo the democratic gains that were made in the 20th century. When Reagan was leaving office, he said, the presidency is okay and we got the courts. The problem is Congress and the media. Now, the media remains a problem for them, not because the commentators are all liberals. Most of them are conservative. It's because reality is radical, you see. And so if they report reality, this is what infuriates the conservatives. There are conservatives who genuinely think the media is liberal because it reports things. It says, you know, like the war in Iraq cost $10 billion a month. You see, that was a headline in the San Francisco Chronicle. Well, that's the liberal media. No, that's reality. Yeah, but they didn't have to say it, you see, because you wouldn't hear that on Fox. They know what not to say. They understand that really objective journalism means you are a Republican mouthpiece, a reactionary Republican mouthpiece. Reactionaries, they're not conservatives, they're reactionaries. There's the term. They can't even use the term reactionary. And the liberals are very frightened by this incredible campaign that's been going on, a propaganda campaign for 30 years, and their whole view is to try to show how, no, I'm not really that bad that way. No, that's not true. And they can't understand. These guys, a conservative is someone who tries to maximize power to maintain his existing privileges and wealth. A reactionary who's someone who wants to make transformations throughout. There's a very dim, thin line between the two. But reactionaries are people who are pursuing reforms. They even expropriate our word, reforms. And they're talking about, I want to reform. I want to save Medicare. I want to save Social Security. I mean, he's lying when he says that. But they're always on message. They're always they have polemical instincts. And I tell you, a lot of people on the left don't have polemical instincts in that way. They have polemics. Most of their polemics are to others on the left, others to the left of them, usually. Most of the nastiest attacks I've gotten have been from other people on the left. I mean, I don't even want to go to these left things anymore and hear them all start, You get in the car and somebody starts screaming at you about Kronstadt, you know, which happened back in what, in 1920, wasn't it? 1919. Or Barcelona, or the Stalin purges, or this or that. I said, get real. Can we talk about what's happening here? So there are plenty of polemicists, but they don't have, and they're very well organized. They're organized in their funding. They train cadres of young conservatives who go into the foundations, who go into the media, who go into all sorts of organizations, and they got a lot of money, and they're consciously, methodically aware and mobilized, and are always on message. They know what it is they're doing, and we have a harder task. We have a task of trying to educate people, try to let them understand what global warming really is. Their task is simply to deny that that's it, or laugh it off, or finally co-opt it and say, well, we'll use ethanol and methane, and we'll use hydrogen and all. Some of these processes. If George Bush recommends it, you can be sure it's poison. Just be sure. Anything this guy ever brings out is poison. I mean, I have never seen someone so perfectly poisonous as this man, really. I mean, he is really, it is reactionary evil. It really is. I mean, they've already decided that hydrogen fuel, I think, consumes more energy than it finally produces, or it creates as much heat spin-off and all. And ethanol is the one which would be crop-based, isn't it? That's what we need, right? We're going to take the crops. The topsoil crisis is going to take all the crops and use them to run cars with. What an amazing bunch of idiots. All right, before I start devolving into cursing and swearing, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you once again, Michael. His brand new book, The Culture Struggle, is here in the center. Michael will be at this table signing. The older books are over here. So if you could come around this way, don't forget, pay for the older ones at this table.
They're not older. They're not older. They're earlier. These are right.
Earlier, that's it. The vintage books are over here. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy this fabulous new book, and thank you, Michael.
Well,